From the nation's capital, the American Enterprise Institute for Public Policy Research presents Public Policy Forums, a series of programs featuring the nation's top authorities presenting their differing views on the vital issues which confront us. Today's topic, how long should they serve? Limiting terms for the President and Congress.
Would we have better government if presidents served for only one term and never ran for office again? Would a limit on congressional terms deprive the voters of the right to re-elect their representatives for as many times as they wish? Does a democracy such as ours require a more frequent turnover in many top government offices? Welcome to another Public Policy Forum presented by AEI, the American Enterprise Institute, a nonprofit, nonpartisan research and education organization. Appearing on our panel today are John Danforth, Republican Senator from Missouri, a member of the Senate Committee on Governmental Affairs; Charles Bartlett, a Pulitzer Prize-winning newspaper columnist and director of the Foundation for the Study of Presidential and Congressional Terms; Jeane Kirkpatrick, resident scholar at AEI and Levy professor at Georgetown University; Walter Berns, AEI resident scholar and constitutional expert. John Charles Daly will moderate today. He served as top news executive for CBS and ABC News. Now, here is Mr. Daly.
This Public Policy Forum, part of a series presented by the American Enterprise Institute, is concerned with an issue our founding fathers struggled with in the Articles of Confederation and in the 1787 Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. Our subject, how long should they serve, limiting terms for presidents and the Congress? Well, since that Constitutional Convention, nearly 360 proposals have been introduced through the years to alter the president's term in one way or another. Some 180 of these proposals have been for a 6-year term, and a half of the 180 have included single-term limitations. On the other hand, most of the proposals to limit the number of congressional terms are rather recent. In fact, 3/4 of them have been introduced since 1970 and 50 in the past 7 years. Presidents Andrew Jackson, Harrison, Polk, Hayes, Cleveland, Taft, Johnson, Nixon, and Carter have or tended to support a single term for president. President Jackson in 1830 perhaps made the classic argument, in order, he said, particularly that his appointment may, as far as possible, be placed beyond the reach of any improper influences, in order that he may approach the solemn responsibilities of the highest office in the gift of a free people, uncommitted to any other course than the strict line of constitutional duty, and that the securities of this independence may be rendered as strong as the nature of power and the weakness of its possessor will admit, I cannot too earnestly invite your attention to the propriety of promoting such an amendment to the Constitution as will render him ineligible after one term of service, end quote. In view of President Jackson's fabled temper, it is probably well that he and Harry Truman lived at different times. Noting that you do not have to be very smart to know that an office holder who is not eligible for re-election loses a lot of influence, President Truman bluntly disagreed. You have taken a man and put him in the hardest job in the world, he said, and sent him out to fight our battles in a life and death struggle, and you have sent him out to fight with one hand tied behind his back because everyone knows he can't run for re-election. If he is not a good president and you do not want to keep him, you do not have to re-elect him. There is a way to get rid of him, and it does not require a constitutional amendment to do it. And so, panel, a first question posed to each of you in turn. Should presidential and congressional terms be limited? Senator Danforth.
Well, Mr. Daly, I have introduced resolutions for constitutional amendments to limit the number of terms a person can serve in the Congress. I have excluded presidents from that, because in the presidential question I can really see the pluses and minuses of such an amendment, but I feel most strongly about people who serve in the United States Senate and the House of Representatives. I think that it's clear to anybody who spends time on the hustings, as those of us in politics do, that there is a very serious breakdown of communication and trust between the American people and their government in Washington. So I think that there is a search for some mechanism, some rethinking of our existing way of doing things in order to close the gap between Washington and the American people, and to make it clear that at least those who serve in the Congress of the United States are not full-time politicians, full-time inhabitants of Washington, but are really citizens on leave to their government for an abbreviated term of years, and that eventually they will be returning back home to the people who sent them there in the first place.
Professor Kirkpatrick.
Yes, I oppose limitations of terms for the Congress or further limitations of terms for the presidency on several grounds. I believe basically that the proposals would not accomplish their proposed ends, but would in fact produce unanticipated and undesired and real harm. I think, first of all, that the desire to liberate presidents from the temptations of ambition would in fact liberate presidents still further from the disciplines of accountability. That great motive to the public good, which Governor Morris called it, of seeking re-election, we think, many of us, helps keep presidents responsive. I think that the desire to free presidents from the interests, the pressures of interests, will in fact leave them less concerned about building consensus and seeking consent, leave them less responsive to the views and values of voters, and produce a less representative government. I think the desire to free the people of full-time politicians, as Senator Danforth suggested, would in fact emancipate them from us, from experienced leadership. It would deprive us of leadership and deprive us of a choice, us, we the people, of a choice that is rightly ours, namely the decision of whether or not our congressman or president should continue in office or whether we should in fact throw the rascal out. Finally, I think instead of resulting in wiser legislation and better public policy, we would get weaker presidents, weaker Congresses, less able to solve problems, most specifically less able to control the bureaucracy, and finally less able to govern in a complicated world.
Mr. Bartlett?
Well, George Washington warned us that there's this love of power and the proneness to abuse it which predominates in the human heart. And it's for that reason that I am heartily in favor of both of these reforms. I believe that the presidency would be liberated not from politics, but from the strings that now tie it down, from the strings which make it impossible for the president to be what Woodrow Wilson wanted him to be, which was as big a man as he can be in conscience and law. And I think we have a president now who has really not a 4-year term, but a 3-year term, because he is faced with this necessity to go out in the final year of his term and shake hands across airport fences and do all the things that politicians have done with great success in different parts of the country, but which really do not become a president, which subject him to unnecessary hazards and limit his ability to carry on the functions of government. For that reason, I am heartily in favor of the one term for president, and I join Senator Danforth in his feeling that we should limit the service in Congress because we lose the freshness, we don't bring in the talent that exists out in the country, and we get wedded to people who become more isolated from the electorate as they persist in seniority.
Professor Berns?
I must stand with Professor Kirkpatrick and oppose both these proposed amendments. Since 1960, there have been some 4,000 proposals introduced in one of the two branches, the House or the Senate, to amend the Constitution. 4,000 proposals, many of these, of course, repetitions. Of these, 4 have led to constitutional amendments, and of course we have 2 that have been proposed, formally adopted by the House and the Senate, and are awaiting their ratification. So they're somewhere out in the states awaiting ratification. There is something, I think, to be said against tampering with the Constitution, and so that in any individual case, a strong case has to be made for the amendment. A heavy burden has to be borne by those who propose amending. I know Senator Danforth and Mr. Bartlett would agree with this. The question has, of course, then it comes down to this, whether they can successfully bear the burden. I agree with many of the things that Professor Kirkpatrick has said, and would add only one other element, something she did not mention. To be found frequently in the literature advocating these two amendments is the term citizen legislator. That's a recurring phrase, citizen legislator. It reminds us of the position adopted by the Anti-Federalists in 1787 to 1788, the idea that the ideal senator or congressman, legislator, would be a kind of Cincinnatus who would put his plow down temporarily, come to Washington, serve in office here, but even during the time he was serving in this public service, his principal business remained plowing. I somehow think that the job of a congressman or a senator is, especially in our day, more exacting than that. It requires more experience, more talents. I therefore do not believe in the idea of citizen legislator, and to the extent that these proposals embody that notion, I am opposed to them.
Senator Danforth.
Yes, well, I first of all, based on firsthand experience, don't think, as a matter of fact, that being a member of the United States Senate or the Congress of the United States involves the possession of some technical talent. Learning the rules of the Senate is something that can be done, I think, and can be mastered by most people with any degree of intelligence, but I think that more important than any technical skill is a matter of judgment. And it's my view that there are thousands of people in any state. We have in the state of Missouri nearly 5 million people. There are thousands, maybe tens or hundreds of thousands of people who have excellent judgment and could do an excellent job serving either in the Senate or in the House of Representatives. So I don't view government, and particularly the federal government, as being a fine art so much as a matter of judgment. And I think that the basic judgment of the people in my state is that somehow Washington has gotten overrun by the experts, the consultants, the people who have mastered all the details of Washington, and therefore it's gotten even more remote from the basic judgment and the basic common sense of the people.
Professor Kirkpatrick?
Yes, well, once again, I find myself in disagreement with Senator Danforth.
That's splendid.
I agree with him entirely, however, that technical knowledge and technical expertise is not what makes a good legislator, much less a great legislator. I think it's quite clear that it is judgment that makes a great legislator, or even a good one, and that judgment is very closely related to experience, and that the decisions in public policy are prudential decisions that aren't technical at all, but involve knowledge of the country, knowledge of the issues, knowledge of how the government functions, knowledge of the pitfalls between intention and implementation. And I think it, as the Marxists like to say, it is no accident that our greatest legislators have been men of long experience in the Congress, in the House of Representatives and in the Senate. I think of people like Henry Clay, like Robert Taft, like George Norris, like Hubert Humphrey. We could expand that list almost indefinitely.
Mr. Bartlett.
Does Professor Kirkpatrick think, though, that experience in Washington is really what we need to make a government that is representative, that really works in terms of the people? It seems to me that this is the problem. We have this tremendous Washington experience, but we don't have the sort of the world experience. We don't have the experience with the people, what it is like out there. They're not living with the laws that they write, that kind of thing. As you know, the Washington way of life, we have 12 months of Congress now. They're here constantly. They live here, their wives and children are here, their golf bags are here. This is their life. They go home because they have to stay in contact with the people, and they do that. But the fact is that when they retire, they tend to stay here. Did a survey, I think it was 2/3 of the retired members of Congress are living in the Washington area.
May a panelist ask a question?
Oh, of course.
I know this is somewhat unfair, but it will, I think, it's an exaggeration, but it will focus our minds, I think, on something that is important here. Among these 4,000 proposed amendments that have been proposed and introduced in the House or the Senate the last few years, there was one a few years ago by Senators Aberesk, Gravel, and Hatfield, as I recall, a kind of popular initiative proposal whereby if 3% of the people who voted a previous election so indicate, then an initiative is put on the ballot of the next federal election to be voted up or down as law without amendment. This I think is carrying the point you gentlemen make to its extreme.
No, it isn't.
You mean it's not an extreme? Would you accept that?
No.
No.
I don't think it has anything to do with it.
Well, I think it has only insofar as it represents this notion that it's the citizen legislator carried to that extreme of abolishing the legislature altogether and simply removing that legislature as a man between public policy and the people.
Let me just say in response to that, I believe in a Republican form of government. I believe in representative government. I don't believe that you do it by public opinion polls, but you do it through the legislative process, the process that has served our country very well now for the last 200 years. I do believe that there is something new, or some things that are new, that have entered into the picture since our founding fathers wrote the Constitution. For example, the technique of polling, the technique of the use of the media, the tremendous advantage that incumbents have in the use of the media, the organization of interest groups which are able to disseminate their views to their membership in a very efficient and effective way. I think that all of these are changes since 200 years ago or so when we adopted the Constitution. And the effect of that is to make the process of electioneering, the process of appealing to one interest group or another, much more effective and much more sophisticated than it ever could have been when the Founding Fathers set up the Constitution in the first place. And therefore, the problem that has been created for representative government is precisely that congressmen are so anxious to appeal to each pressure group, to each interest group, to do everything to keep themselves in office just one more term. So it seems to me that the greatest advantage of a constitutional amendment limiting terms is precisely that it says to the congressman, well, you're not going to be there forever. That eventually you are going to be home. Eventually you're going to return to the real world. And it is not a matter of saying anything, doing anything, promising anything to each interest group that comes along in turn in order to keep yourself in office, because there is an end to all this.
And could I add a postscript on that mistake? It adds the perception by the public of what the elected official is up to. It seems to me is very much at issue here. President Carter, when he made his pronouncement in favor of the one-term presidency, he complained about the fact that a lot of the things I do are colored through the news media and in the minds of the American people by question mark. Is this a campaign ploy, or is it genuinely done by an incumbent president in the best interest of our country without any sort of personal advantage involved? And this is true of our legislators, it's true of our president. There's this constant tendency, and I can say this as a member of the press, to look at them as people who are maneuvering to their own advantage, who are constantly striving to get some personal advantage out of public affairs with complete disregard of the national interest. And I think this is the reason that we tend to berate our president so heavily. It's a tendency, the view of Congress, what is it, 13 or 19% approval of Congress as a body. These things stem from this perception of what these people, these elected officials are up to.
Mrs. Kirkpatrick.
Yes. if the people imagine that congressmen spend their time in the House and Senate principally thinking about how to be reelected, then the people are obviously very badly informed about that. As everybody knows, the retirement rate has never been so high as in the Congress in the past few years. The turnover rate in the Congress has produced a Senate, 49 members of which have been elected since Richard Nixon resigned. Nearly half of the House has been elected for the first time since Richard Nixon resigned. We have, in fact, a relatively inexperienced Congress filled with lots of new faces, and we have, 40, 50, 30 people resigning each year, choosing not to run, not liking the life on the Hill. I think I'd like to make another point, if I may, though. This Charles Bartlett and I have disagreed on this before, let me say. This search for the perfectly disinterested legislator or the perfectly disinterested president. The notion that you can find a lawgiver or a lawmaker who is going to find the perfect solution to public policy problems, is a very old one. Plato undertook it many years ago and proposed a philosopher king. The only problem with it is that it rests on a conception of politics which is technocratic and which sees political problems as problems in mathematics that have one single answer, and it imagines that you're going to find the perfectly wise, the perfectly virtuous, the perfectly all-seeing lawmaker who will make the perfectly disinterested law if only he is freed of ambition. I think this is, a mistaken theory of psychology and politics. Bad theory and bad practice.
That's right, but you set up a straw man that knocked it down very well, but it just doesn't have anything to do with the argument that we're making.
Well, I'm glad I knocked it down well.
Nobody is suggesting that there can be a perfectly disinterested human being, or that there can be a perfectly crafted solution to very complicated problems. That's not the point. The point is, are the problems best addressed by people who have their sights fixed on something a little higher than just winning the next election? I think that that's the question.
There is sometimes a feeling that the most intelligent of the people are retiring and leaving the others behind. And one of the, Dr. Kirkpatrick talks about this tremendous turnover. But the fact is, what we have is a committee chairman with an average tenure of 23 years now in the House, versus in the general tenure of the House, the mean tenure is about 7 years. So you're right on one score, but you're wrong in terms of the people who really control the body, who have been there for 23 years and have the clout and are the ones who really pass on what goes through.
Right. I'm sorry, Mr. Berns, you want to...
please, Jeane.
I just wanted to say one thing. Those leaders are held accountable in precisely the same way that the representatives themselves are held accountable. They can be voted out of those committee chairman's position by the rank and file of the Congress, exactly as the representative can be voted out by his constituents if he's not responsive and representative.
Let's come at this from another direction. I referred to President Truman's statement, you don't have to be very smart to know that an office holder who is not eligible for re-election loses a lot of influence. Now, would an official have more or less influence with other parts of government, such as the bureaucracy, for instance, if the term of service was limited? Senator Danforth?
I don't really think that the case could be made that a person loses influence by the fact that he's not going to serve any longer. I think, for example, in the Senate, in the 96th Congress, those people who have made the decision that they're going to retire, people such as Senator Abe Ribicoff from Connecticut, Henry Bellman from Oklahoma, have an enormous amount of clout and sway, both within the Senate itself and I believe within the government as a whole. So I don't think, at least in the Congress, that a person loses any influence at all by making the decision to retire.
And I'd like to add to that the Eisenhower record, Mr. Daly. Many people who have analyzed the Eisenhower years found the second term in some ways more productive than the first.
And I might just add this, and I don't want to do more than my share of talking, but I think that it's fair to say that in the year 1980, an election year, that the business in the Congress of the United States has slowed down to a virtual halt. The Senate doesn't meet on Fridays so that senators can go home and campaign. There are very few votes on Mondays, so that there can be 3-4 day weeks of campaigning.
Mrs. Kirkpatrick.
Yes, I'm very pleased that this discussion has clarified the extent to which those persons who support the limitation of terms desire to emancipate the legislators from the people. Senator Danforth complains, you know, that the congressmen have to go home too often. They spend too much time back in the districts.
No, I didn't say that.
The Senate doesn't meet or the House doesn't meet on Friday because everybody's back in the districts campaigning, worrying about re-election. I think that there's a very interesting point here because it seems to me that popular control and popular responsiveness is in fact guaranteed by accountability and precisely by that marvelous system of engineering ambition to make political power seekers responsive to the people by the hope of re-election. That was, of course, a deliberate intention of those who engineered our Constitution, and I think it's a very wise one, and I think it's been very successful. I think also that the 6-year term, single 6-year term of the president is interesting in this regard because that would, in fact, empower a president for a very long time. 6 years is a long time for a president to be independent of the people. It's quite the contrary of what John Adams suggested, that frequent elections would remind the lawmakers of their close dependence on the people. And I think it's useful to have this relationship between the close dependence on the people and the limitation of terms be clarified in this fashion.
Well, I just don't myself think that there is any connection at all between the concept of accountability and feverish electioneering. And I think that there has got to be, I mean, there is some conceptual difference between the two. I think, as a matter of fact, that it tends to be accountability to a few segments of the public who are particularly interested in particular bills and can give you specific help in your next campaign, rather than concern for exercising the public trust of holding public office.
Professor Berns.
Senator, why would these things that you describe not also be relevant in the case of someone seeking office for the first time? Wouldn't he look to the polls?
I think that the difference is in the perception of a person in public life as to what he's about with his life. I think that the basic question is how that individual sees himself or herself. Do you see yourself as somebody who has moved to Washington for good, who has acquired a home, put your kids in school, and by golly, you'll do anything to stay there? Or do you see yourself as a person, when you seek the job and when you hold the job, being there for a limited period of time as a representative of the people who sent you there, who will eventually return to those people? So I think basically it's a question of self-perception.
You gained some rhetorical advantage here, and I want to take it away from you. Let me pose the same question somewhat differently with respect to this man who's in Washington. Do you see yourself as a committed public servant, not, as you put it, as the man who will do anything to stay here, but do you see yourself as a man who, in the course of some time here, in experience with these factions and those factions, with experience with senatorial or congressional staff members, with the bureaucracy, with the White House, with everybody else in Washington, has acquired some insight into the way this system works? Do you see yourself as a man like Senator Jackson, for example, who was able, I think, much better than the average citizen of the state of Washington to understand all the implications of the SALT agreement and so forth? Do you see yourself as that kind of man, and do we want him? And I may say so, if this constitutional amendment had been adopted, Scoop Jackson would have been out of Washington a long time ago, and that would have been a national disaster.
Let me, if I may, come in, because our time is getting short. The great malaise of the country, you would believe, if you read and listen to general comment nowadays, is that the basic attitude in the country is take care of yourself and the devil take the hindmost. Now, do you see that limiting terms would tend to insulate public officials from the influence of the special interest group, which has a very basic, narrow interest and not the general public interest in mind? Who would like to start?
I'd like to say that I think that the special interest groups are us, you know. We are all members of some special interest group. Either we are truckers, or we are mothers, or we're members of PTA, or we're employees of nonprofit organizations, or we're soldiers, or we're oil men, or we are all members of some special interest. I think that the notion of liberating lawmakers from the special interests is a most dangerous notion, which in fact means, when it's translated into action, means liberating lawmakers from responsiveness and accountability to people.
But I think that Professor Kirkpatrick is taking rhetorical advantage there, because it doesn't seem to me that you're liberating anybody from anything. It seems to me that in the kind of government we have, with these evenly balanced three parts, and with the pressures that exist if you want to get anything done, with the question of getting public opinion behind you on the big moves that you make, whether you're a president or a senator or a member of the House, it seems to me that you've got to deal in politics. So nobody's ever going to be liberated from politics when they're in government, because that's what government is, politics. And so it isn't a question of liberation, it's a question of lifting them out of the lowest level of politics, which is shaking hands over that fence, when you really should be reading the reports or thinking about the great things that you want to do.
Why is that the lowest level of politics, Mr. Bartlett?
Well, I don't think it's an
shaking hands over the fence, but it's seeking the suffrage of your constituents, the people. Why is that the lowest level?
Well, it's the ritual by which you get elected, and pressing the flesh is a very big part of it. And I'm not here to knock it, but I do think that it's if you have a president of the United States, there are better ways in which he could be using his time, in my opinion, particularly in these days.
Let me seize the rhetorical advantage.
Go, go, go.
I think that the problem is that the parts are greater than the whole. That is to say that if you were to ask most of the public, hey, what do you think about the federal government? Do you think it's too big? Do you think it's too expensive? Do you like the deficits? Do you like all the regulation? Most people would say, look, get it off of our backs. That is, I think, definitely the general consensus of people. The problem is that they say, get it off of our backs, except for those aspects of government that are helpful to our group. And therefore, what we see is very few people coming to Washington or approaching us as members of the Congress saying, we want less. Mostly they say, we want more. And what a politician does, in point of fact, when he looks toward the next election, is aggregate interest groups equaling at least 50% plus one of the voters. And the way to do that is to say yes, seriatim, to a whole host of different interest groups. And they parade through Washington and you see them. And I just don't think that it is the same as accountability, or it is the same as serving the public, to try to aggregate enough interest groups who are beholden to you for specific items on their legislative agenda so that you can get 51% of the vote.
I repeat the question I asked earlier, Senator, because it seems to me to be altogether relevant here as it was then, I think. Why won't the challenger do the same thing that the incumbent is doing? These interest groups, you say, besiege the incumbent, and he aggregates 51%. If the challenger is to be successful, he too must aggregate, and he too must promise, and the budget goes up just as much.
Well, I think the answer to that is that there is no, I mean, it is not a search for perfection. It is a search for a relative improvement in the existing situation. And the basic issue is, how does a person who seeks or holds public office look at himself or herself? Do you look at yourself as a person who has a breadth of interests, a person who has a lot of things you want to do with your life, a person who's got a home to go to, a person who has another line of work that you can always go to, something else that you can do? Or instead, do you look at yourself as a full-time professional politician, incapable and uninterested in doing anything else? A person so overjoyed with being in public office that you can't see yourself as being in anything but public office. And that is the whole theory behind the idea of a constitutional amendment limiting terms, to try to build in a mechanism so that people who come here know when they come here and know when they seek the job that being in Washington, that serving the government in Washington is not the be-all and end-all of life.
And causing
But
people.
serving the government is a very good thing, you know. I don't think we want to knock it. What we need probably is more of it, isn't it? I mean, we worry about cynicism and the decline of public spirit and the decline of a public philosophy. Serving the government is surely what that is. I'd like to go back to that 50%
He wants
plus
to drive
one.
Winston Churchill out of politics.
Yes, well,
No.
I'd like to go back to that as well as Coop
Winston
Jackson.
Churchill,
I'd like to go back to the 50% plus
Traffic
one, if I
cotton.
may, just a minute. Let me just say, what you call aggregating interests is what other people call building consensus, and the product of that, which you call government by interest group, some people call government by consent.
Mr. Bartlett?
No, I just find that the freshness that you would get from bringing in people who have not made a career of government, particularly a career of elective office, would be an enormous enrichment of the government. It's quite clear now that these people who run these committees and have been around for 23 years, they've made their alliances, they've made it a way of life, they've learned how to do it, and they've learned how to survive, which is admirable. But at the same time, if in their place you had people who'd come in from private life where they felt that they'd done enough so they could now give 12, 24 years to the government, and they'd go and run for Congress with the hopes that maybe eventually they'd get to the Senate, I think you'd have an entirely different and much more representative and much fresher kind of Congress. And that's really sort of my dream for this reform.
I'm afraid this is the old dream that's based on an equation of innocence with virtue, isn't it? When innocence can more accurately be equated with ignorance, and usually leads not, you know, to creativity, but to incompetence.
I am very innocent and full of virtue, and I think we have opened this subject up very broadly. And so, with the time where it is, I think it probably is time we start taking questions for the question and answer session. Yes, sir, on this side.
Yes, Austin Ranney, the American Enterprise Institute. I think everyone in the audience has greatly enjoyed comparing what we all know are the unsatisfactory circumstances of the present situation with Mr. Bartlett and Senator Danforth's eager longing for the paradise that will come if we limit terms, and the great fears that Professors Kirkpatrick and Berns have. It occurs to me that if it isn't too far a deviation from the way the panel is doing it, we might look at a few comparative facts rather than reasoning everything from first principle. And I note from a little hasty research I did before this meeting that at the present time, 21 states allow their governors to be reelected as many times as the voters desire, and presumably they are really terribly governed. 24 states restrict their governors to 2 4-year terms, or a total of 8 years in office, but 5 states, the real objects of scorn here, the states of Kentucky, New Mexico, South Carolina, Tennessee, and Virginia, remember those names, prohibit their governors from succeeding themselves, so they are limited not to 1 6-year term, but to 1 4-year term. My question to Mr. Bartlett and to Senator Danforth is, will you please tell us to what degree and in what respects are those 5 states significantly better governed than the other 45 states?
Which you would like to start? Mr. Bartlett, you volunteered.
My experience in the affairs of those states is very limited, so I can't really judge them, but I don't think it's comparable. I don't think that the role of a governor is comparable today in any respect to the role of the president. The burdens that exist upon him, I think that the analogy is really weak.
You'd rather not answer the question.
Well, I can't, because I really haven't gone down to those states and lived in there. You know, every state is getting by, and none of them declared war, so they're probably going along all right. But I think we're faced with a problem here where the president has really got more than he can do. I don't accept them really as laboratory examples of what's going on here in Washington with the conflux of problems that we have.
Thank you.
Senator Danforth, would you like to respond to that question?
Well, I don't know what's going on in the state governments of any state except one, and that is my own state of Missouri. And I couldn't argue from one example I mean, state government in Missouri is perfectly terrible. And our governor has, by Constitution, only a possibility of 2 terms. But I think that that has to do with the incompetence of the individual who is now in that office rather than a general principle that I could deduce from it. Can we show that in Missouri? Can we show
Sure.
that?
All right. Next question? Yes, sir.
Richard Smolka from American University. I'd like to direct my question, almost following up Austin Ranney's, not to the executive office, but to the representative branch of government. The representative branch of government gives us no examples that I'm aware of limiting terms in the United States. And I was wondering whether you gentlemen and Professor Kirkpatrick might cite some examples of any free Western democracy or any democratic form of government anywhere in the world which limits the rights of the citizens to choose their representatives, and what that experience has been.
Who would like to start that?
Well, I'll be happy to.
Danforth?
Yes, the United States does. Clearly, we limit the rights of people to choose their representatives. You have to be over 25 years of age.
I meant in terms of office, once they qualify as candidates. Years in office. That's, I'm not talking about.
No, I don't know of any.
I know the Mexican legislature is restricted to 1 term. That'll help you.
Is that
just as
the model
president
for
is
your proposal?
The Mexican presidency is a 6-year presidency.
One would be slow to cite the Mexican government, I think, as a model of anything one would desire to emulate.
All right, next question, please.
Russell Chapin, American Enterprise Institute. Senator Danforth, I believe I've read something that you've written with regard to the constant pressure to spend to get reelected is having something to do with the shift of power from the states to the federal government. Would you like to clarify that for us, sir?
Yes, I think that there is that one of the most successful tools that has been generally available to people in elective office is to purport to do great things for the public. And in the federal government, I think that there's been a growing tendency of people in the federal government to expand the relative power of the federal government relative to state and local governments and to the private sector. And that the typical campaign promise, as a matter of fact, is elect me and I will commence a new program, set up a new agency, launch a new spending initiative, and so on. And therefore, the basic approach in running a campaign, by and large, has been to say yes, and very seldom to say no. The people who say no, the people who say the unpopular things, tend to lose, I believe. And therefore, you have, as a response to all this, a constant expansion of the size and of the shape and of the cost of the federal government. I think since 1970, we have had a 200% increase in federal spending, 400% increase in federal transfer payments. And this is I think, direct reaction to this very expansive view of what the federal government is and what it does.
That's very interesting, if I may add a word.
Please.
Since we've had during the same period, of course, an even more dramatic expansion of state governments and of county governments and municipal governments. These are, in fact, the budgets that have grown most dramatically, especially in the last decade, and the levels at which the number of government employees have grown most dramatically. So there must be something else operating besides simply the desire of federal office holders to expand the power of federal government. There must be something more basic operating, persuading publicly elected officials and non-publicly elected officials to expand the powers of government. That's, I think one's got to face that.
This is the 3rd time, and now I'm seeking a formulation that will be absolutely persuasive to everybody here. The question is, what does political science tell us? Or wisdom tell us with respect to the following question. Who, the incumbent or the man who challenges the incumbent, is more likely to make extravagant promises? I don't know whether there is a chapter in political science American government textbooks or other textbooks that provide the answer to that question, but my my experience suggests that it is more likely that he who seeks the office is going to make the more extravagant promise, including a monetary promise. I think, for example, of the khaki election following World War I in Britain, where the question was reparations to be demanded of the Germans. And those in public office had some knowledge of the possible limits that what might be exacted from the Germans, whereas those on the outside said, you know, we'll make them pay until the pips squeak. I think in that particular case, it will be shown that Winston Churchill in office was aware of the possible limits and therefore made the most modest promises that he could make compatible with his re-election chances and sober sense with respect to fiscal international policy, and those out of office saw no limit whatever. The question I repeat again is, what does political science tell us as to who is more likely to make the extravagant promises and therefore is responsible for this exaggerated behemoth that we talk about in Washington?
It is perfectly clear, as a monograph developed by the American Enterprise Institute shows very nicely, called The Growth of Government in the West, done by the late Warren Nutter. It's perfectly clear that government has grown everywhere in the post-war period. It has grown dramatically in the West and in the Western democracies and in all the Western democracies, and it has also grown in all modern industrial non-democracies, that is, in the dictatorships and the autocracies of various kinds. The spending of government has increased, and the bureaucracies of government has grown, and the powers and scope of government's decisions have in fact expanded. So I think, you know, we're back to the question we started with, my colleague Walter Berns started with. The question is not so much whether the ills to which you allude exist, but whether the remedies you propose are in fact of such nature that they would constitute the remedies for which you hope. And my guess is that you would, as has happened with a good many well-intentioned reforms in recent history, that you would create more ills with your remedies than perhaps already exist.
Well, my view is that the remedy is one, really, and that's simply realism. Realism about government and what it is and what it can accomplish, and realism about oneself. Do you see yourself as a public office holder as being somebody who just must always serve in public office? Or do you see yourself as a whole person who has other things to do with your life?
And in evaluating the remedy, Professor Kirkpatrick, I think it would be fair to look at the fact that the one-term presidency has been endorsed by almost every important president who's held that office.
Professor Kirkpatrick?
I think virtually all presidents and most politicians, of whom I have a good deal higher regard, generally speaking, than Senator Danforth does, would in fact like to be freed of the disciplines of accountability. They would like to be freed of the disciplines of submitting themselves and their performance to the judgment of the voters in the upcoming election. I think this is quite true. I don't at all doubt that President Carter, for example, or almost any other president in office, or as he reflects back on it, would like to think of himself as having had 2 more years free of the constraints of the interests, free of the constraints of responsiveness to the voters, able to simply implement his vision of the public good. Now, the problem is, of course, that his vision of the public good is not necessarily the only vision of the public good, and it isn't necessarily even a good vision of the public good. And it isn't that necessarily of a majority of voters. And I don't think we want, in fact, to let our presidents judge what kind of restraints they will exercise power under, or for what kind of terms, and in what context.
All right, should we go to a next question, please? Yes, sir.
Yes, I'm Robert Goldwin of the American Enterprise Institute. I've been trying to imagine what it would be like if these proposals were adopted. And so if I assume that we now have a one-term, 6-year president, and congressmen and senators limited to 12 years, then I think to myself, that means these electioneering, campaigning congressman will have 5 elections to run in where they'll be influenced by the desire to be reelected, and then 2 years at the end, their last term, when they'll be free of those constraints and can be statesmanlike. Unless you mean, so that would be 1/6 reduction of their electioneering. Unless you mean increasing their terms to 3 years, then they have 4 terms, and so there'd be 1/4 of their time when they wouldn't be influenced by the necessity to be reelected. The senators would be half their time concerned about being reelected, and then half their time free to be statesmen. And the president all this time would be ignoring interests. I wonder what the fit would be. That is, he'd have a Congress most of the time still concerned about being reelected, having to listen to the interests. The president, some strange kind of non-political being trying to deal with them.
Well, I think you've sort of drawn the thing ad absurdum, because in the first place, the President of the United States with one term would not be oblivious to everything that was going on. He would be the President of the United States with enormous concern for his place in history, with enormous concern for this country, of which he is a citizen. And he would be working just as hard as presidents are today, only he wouldn't be working with politicians trying to fabricate deals in states.
But the Congress would be full of politicians.
The politicians, but the people who would be in the top of the Congress, the people who would hold these chairmanships, would at this point be removed from their necessity to go out and deal with the groups, and the necessity of these alliances that the chairmen now make with the special interest groups, which are so blatant that they become painful to watch in Washington. I think that you'd liberate the people who would be at the top of the congressional pile on both sides of the Capitol from this election pressure. So it wouldn't be quite as bizarre as you make it sound.
Some things pain you more than they pain me. If I look at the list of senators and congressmen who have the longest service, it seems to me they're much superior to the ones who have shorter service. I mean, I think of Senator Jackson.
That's a pretty good generalization. I don't really have time to go through the whole list.
Well, it's a great list. You ought to look at it.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to say some favorable things about those of us who are in our first term. I don't think we're so bad. You know, I'll tell you that I think that the basic point is very simple. The basic point is this. The end of the movie Patton quotes what the slave says to the conquering hero as he leads the victorious procession back through the triumphal gate. Sic transit gloria mundi. So goes the glory of the world. And I think that that is a very important message for people in the public sector, for people in political life, that public office, the trappings of public office, the signs that say senators only, all of the trappings that go with it that tend to isolate it and insulate it, even the title, that these are matters that are not going to be with you forever, and that basically you're a human being, and that you have other interests and other concerns, and you're going to return to them. And it just seems to me that from the standpoint of personal humility, that is a very, very important thing.
I think that response and the example of General Patton shows the excessive expectations you have of life and of public service. General Patton was a professional soldier. We all know, and General Eisenhower was another, we all know about the trappings of military life, and we all know of the terrible dangers we're exposed to when people devote their lives to something like that, and all the perquisites that go with it. But it was General Patton and professionals like him who won the war for us. And I wouldn't have wanted to serve under amateurs who had a 12-year limit when my life was at stake. And I don't want legislators who don't have the experience. And I'm willing to put up with some of the dangers, just as I would be willing to put up with dangers of having a man like General Patton, who got carried away at times by the tremendous powers he had.
All right, next question, please. Yes, sir.
My name is William Mecke. I'm with the Foundation for the Study of Presidential and Congressional Terms. I'd like to go at this from the opposite end. If we were to limit the service of the President and Congress, what is going to make the voter spend any less time in choosing that person? You seem to have championed the voter as it is. Now, why would we spend less time picking our people if we knew that they were going to be limited?
I think there is not a question about whether a voter would spend more time if he were voting for a president who would serve 6 years rather than a president who would stay in office 4 years. I don't think, I wish he would. I think 6 years is a very long time to empower a president for, let me say. If there were 2 presidents from each state, as there are 2 senators from each state, I wouldn't worry so much about letting them stay in office for 6 years without having them held accountable for their stewardship. But I think there's only one president, and there's a great power lodged in the office. And 6 years is, from my point of view, too long to vest power in him. But just let me say, I think that in voting for an incumbent, voters who desire to make well-informed decisions are in a much better position than when they are voting for non-incumbents, because they have much better grounds for judging the incumbent. They know much more about how he will behave in office, how carefully he will tend to the public business, how freely he will consort with which interest groups will he in fact equate with the public interests, and which interest groups will he call the private interests.
2 points. One is certainly that the present system is thoroughly boring the American voter. We did have, as most of you know, a 54% turnout at the last presidential election. So if this system is designed to elicit participation on the part of the citizen, we are failing. Second point, Professor Kirkpatrick is very anxious to have incumbents run so that the voters can judge their record. We are financing the re-election campaigns of the incumbents today, and we're financing them to a merry tune.
On behalf of AEI, our heartfelt thanks to the distinguished and expert panelists, Mr. Bartlett, Senator Danforth, Professor Kirkpatrick, and Professor Berns, and also our thanks to our guests and experts attending the forum for their participation. Good night.
This public policy forum on limiting terms for the President and Congress has brought you the views of 4 experts in the field. It was presented by AEI, the American Enterprise Institute. It is the aim of AEI to clarify issues of the day by presenting many viewpoints, in the hope that by so doing, those who wish to learn about the decision-making process will benefit from such a free exchange of informed and enlightened opinion. I'm Peter Hackus in Washington.
This Public Policy Forum series is created and supplied to this station as a public service by the American Enterprise Institute, Washington, D.C. AEI is a nonprofit, nonpartisan, publicly supported research and education organization. For a transcript of this program, send $3.75 to the American Enterprise Institute, 1150 17th Street Northwest, Washington, D.C. 20036.